Good day, my dearest listeners. Lady Whistledown's here with another juicy story. You may wish to pour yourself a glass of champagne before I begin, for tonight's tale was born not of love, but of pride, and I dare say it shall leave the heart quite breathless by the final page. London hums tonight with gossip more dazzling than the chandeliers of the royal ballroom. I, your ever-faithful observer of hearts and hypocrisies, was there to witness it all, the lie that set the season ablaze. The winter gala, that glittering circus of silk, envy and ambition, unfolded beneath the great chandeliers of Astoria Hall. Every noble name worth whispering attended, and every secret worth keeping trembled on the edge of discovery. The air smelled of perfume and polished greed. Diamonds winked, fans fluttered, and reputations trembled like candles in the draught. And yet, amid the music and murmur, one figure commanded the room's devotion and dread alike, the Duke of Thornhaven. Arthur. A name that could hush a corridor. The man himself, tall, severe, cut from shadow and ice, stood alone beneath the chandeliers, his expression carved from something colder than marble. He did not smile. He did not dance. He did not even pretend to listen when society's daughters blushed and curtsied in his direction. They called him ruthless, though few had ever seen his cruelty firsthand. They only knew that his fortune was vast, his stare lethal, and his heart, if such a thing still existed, locked far beyond mortal reach. And yet, as fate would dare it, or perhaps as the gods of irony themselves decreed, the night chose to test the unmovable. Across the ballroom's glittering expanse stood a young woman who did not belong, Miss Beatrix, the merchant's daughter. Her gown was modest, her confidence uncertain, her beauty the quiet kind that blooms only under moonlight. While the lords and ladies preened for attention, she lingered by the marble columns, half hidden from sight, watching the spectacle with wide, wondering eyes. She looked at the world as though it was something fragile, unaware that she was about to shatter it. It began with a whisper. The Duke's greatest rival, Lord Silas Ravenshire, approached, a serpent cloaked in charm. He had mocked Arthur before the Queen's court, and tonight he sought another victory, to see the great Thornhaven humiliated in his own silence. I, of course, saw it forming long before it happened. The cruel smile, the taunting tone, the crowd leaning closer like hounds scenting blood. And then, my dearest listeners, came the moment that will be spoken of in every drawing room from Mayfair to Hyde Park. The Duke, who knew what he was going to talk about, and whose pride was as impenetrable as his fortune, turned sharply, his gaze cutting through the room until it found her. The merchant's daughter. Sweet, startled Beatrix. Before a single thought could steady his reason, he crossed the ballroom in 3 decisive strides, seized her gloved wrist, and drew her against him. Gasps scattered through the air like pearls spilling across marble. The orchestra faltered. Even the chandeliers seemed to tremble. "Pretend you're with me," he murmured. A single lie, a single heartbeat, and London would never be the same again. With that reckless whisper, he turned to his rival, his arm firmly around the bewildered girl's waist. "Allow me to introduce my lady," he said, his voice calm and cruelly precise. Oh, what a performance it was! Lord Silas, stunned but not ready to accept defeat, loudly announced that the Duke was able to get someone to love him, the crowd inhaling scandal as though it were perfume. Beatrix frozen in disbelief as her name was tethered to one of the most powerful men in England. And I, ever the chronicler of chaos, nearly dropped my quill. By dawn, the story had taken root. The ink on the invitations of half the ton had not dried before tongues began wagging. The Duke of Thornhaven has chosen a lady, a commoner, a merchant's daughter. It was perhaps the most delicious act of defiance a man like Arthur could commit. Or the most fatal. Yet pride, my dears, is a strange creature. When the morning light dared expose his folly, the Duke did not deny it. Instead, he called upon Beatrix's father, a modest gentleman flattered beyond reason, and made a request that chilled every servant's whisper at Thornhaven estate. The young lady was to remain under his care until the season's end, and so, under the guise of propriety, Miss Beatrix found herself delivered to the grand estate that the city called Thornhaven, and I dare say she stepped through its iron gates with the poise of a lamb unaware of the wolf awaiting her. London celebrated a love story. I smelled a tragedy. Inside those towering walls, rumour says the Duke revealed his true nature. His silence sharp as knives, his eyes stormed with something darker than anger. Servants spoke of locked doors, quiet corridors, and the echo of her steps where laughter should have been. Yet even cruelty, it seems, could not mask the sorrow that haunted his gaze. I have seen men who burn for power and men who bleed for love, but Arthur, dear listeners, appeared to be a man punished by both. Still, Beatrix endured. Perhaps it was innocence, perhaps it was courage, or perhaps it was the first stirring of that most dangerous of all emotions, compassion. In the stillness of that cold manor, she began to see what London never had, that beneath his pride lay grief and beneath his cruelty, a man who had forgotten how to feel. But let us not mistake pity for peace, for the ton is a predator that feeds upon illusion, and illusion is a delicate thing. Even now, as the snow settles upon the marble steps of Thornhaven, I can hear the faintest cracks forming. One lie has the power to save a man's pride, or destroy his soul. And so, the tale begins, with a duke who claimed a woman to silence his enemy, and a woman who would soon learn that even the coldest heart may still bleed when touched by truth. Tell me, dear listener, when pride tempts a heart, is it love, or the beginning of ruin? Tell me, dear viewer, could even you resist such temptation? If my little chronicle has already captured your curiosity, do be so kind as to subscribe. It ensures you never miss my next scandal, confession, or heartbreak unveiled under candlelight. Now tell me, my ever-curious listeners, where in the world are you watching from tonight? London, Canada, Paris, perhaps? Go on, whisper it below. Let us see how far gossip travels. My friends, draw your curtains close and lean nearer to the fire, for tonight we descend beyond the sparkle of the ballroom, into the quieter truths that glitter far less brightly, yet burn far longer. For all of London now speaks of two names in one breath, Thornhaven and Fairbourne. And though the ton delights in the novelty of their pairing, few know the shadows from which they were both born. Miss Beatrix Fairbourne was never meant for grandeur. Hers was a life of measured modesty, the scent of ink and ledgers, the soft rustle of imported silks, the hum of her father's counting room below their modest townhouse on Hanover Street. Her father, Edwin, a man of honest trade and ambition, adored his daughter but dreamed far beyond his station. He raised her not for love, but for opportunity, teaching her to speak softly, walk gracefully, and hide the calluses of work beneath lace. Her world was of merchants and markets, yet her eyes always wandered toward the glittering carriages that swept past her window, carrying ladies who had never known the taste of effort. In truth, Beatrix was her father's greatest investment, and London's latest curiosity. For when the Duke of Thornhaven's impulsive lie crowned her as his lady, it was Edwin who heard fortune knocking. He mistook the Duke's chill civility for patronage, not punishment, and sent his only daughter into that marble cage with a proud smile and a heart blind to consequence. Arthur, however, Arthur was born to consequence. The Duke of Thornhaven's title carried centuries of prestige, and yet he bore it like a chain of iron. His estate stretched from Cornwall's cliffs to the northern moors, but his solitude was his only true domain. Once he had been a man of promise, bold, articulate, admired even by his rivals. He had loved once too, and foolishly. The lady was of noble blood, charming and practised in the art of manipulation. She promised him forever, whispered of elopement, and drew from him every piece of trust he possessed. But on the eve of their escape, she vanished. Her carriage found overturned beyond Blackfriar Bridge, her body cold beneath the river fog. The ton wept for her, The Duke never did. What the world mistook for guilt was grief twisted inward. They whispered that he had driven her to ruin, that his temper had destroyed her. He said nothing to defend himself. Silence, he learned, was the sharpest weapon. It wounded without bleeding. And so from that night on, Arthur Thornhaven lived not as a man, but as a legend of indifference. The heart that once yearned for devotion froze, and the Duke who might have been adored became the man all London feared to love. Now, years later, he finds himself tethered to a name not of his choosing. Beatrix Fairborn, a merchant's daughter who bears the ton's ridicule with unnerving grace. Her presence offends every law of his world, her gentleness disarms every defence he has left. And though the scandal began as his weapon, his means to silence Lord Silas and restore his wounded pride, it now begins to turn upon him. For London, my dear listeners, is never merciful. The gossip spreads like frost across morning glass. In the coffee houses and clubs, the gentlemen laugh, the great Thornhaven caught in his own lie, while their wives, draped in envy, whisper that the girl must possess some wicked charm. Her name appears in letters, her face described with cruel fascination. Invitations to dinners arrive for the Duke alone, as if to remind him she is not welcome. And yet, what none of them see is the quiet war waging within the walls of Thornhaven. The merchant's daughter, who bows but never breaks, and the Duke whose silence speaks more sorrow than scorn. He tells himself it is only duty. It is to protect his pride, a temporary arrangement to preserve his reputation. Yet there are moments, small as candle flickers, when his gaze lingers too long. And so, two lives forged in very different fires now circle one another in uneasy orbit, one bound by guilt, the other by circumstance. He, a man imprisoned by his past. She, a woman traded into his solitude. London calls it a scandal. I, however, suspect it is the beginning of a reckoning. For when pain meets innocence and pride meets patience, something far more dangerous than gossip is bound to bloom. London has always had a taste for spectacle, and nothing delights it more than a duke caught in his own design. The winter gala's whisper has grown into thunder. What began as a lie to silence a rival has now trapped the Duke of Thornhaven within the very scandal he sought to control. Lord Silas, ever the serpent, wasted no time in twisting the tale. "Did you hear?" he crooned over brandy and smoke. "Thornhaven parades a merchant's daughter as his lady. He calls her mine before the Queen's Court dares call her anything at all." The Tun laughed, and laughter, my dears, is the cruelest weapon of all. Cornered by mockery and pride, the Duke made his next move with precision cold enough to shame winter itself. He called upon Mr. Fairborn the very next morning. The merchant, small in stature and swollen with ambition, welcomed him with trembling hands and visions of elevation. The Duke wasted no time on civility. "Your daughter," he said, voice clipped, "will reside at Thornhaven until this tiresome gossip dies. I will not have my name used for amusement." Flattered beyond sense, Mr. Fairborn bowed so low his dignity nearly touched the floor. "Your Grace honours us beyond measure," he stammered. "Beatrix shall be ready by dusk." And thus, with one careless agreement, her fate was sealed. The carriage arrived before the afternoon faded. Beatrix stood in the doorway, pale beneath the weight of her father's pride. She did not speak as her belongings were packed, a single trunk, a few books, a shawl. When the Duke offered his hand to help her into the carriage, she hesitated only once, her eyes lifting to his. For a heartbeat he thought she might refuse him, but she placed her hand in his, and the door shut with a sound that echoed like finality. Thornhaven Estate loomed against the dusk, all stone and silence, its windows lit like watchful eyes. As the carriage rolled to a stop, Beatrix drew a breath that trembled at the edges. The Duke descended first, his gloved hand extended once more. "Welcome to Thornhaven," he said. And though the words were polite, they sounded more like a warning. Inside, the air was heavy with grandeur and neglect. The chandeliers blazed, yet could not warm the marble floors. Servants bowed as the pair passed, their expressions unreadable. Beatrix followed silently, her footsteps soft against the cold stone. When they reached the grand staircase, the Duke turned to her. "You will dine at 7, he said. "The rest of the house is yours, except the west wing. It remains closed." That evening, dinner unfolded like punishment. A table long enough to host 20 sat between them. Candles flickered in silver candelabra, their light too bright for comfort. The Duke ate in silence, his every movement precise. Beatrix's fork remained poised, her appetite gone. Once she attempted conversation, a soft remark about the estate's beauty. He did not look up. "Beauty is irrelevant," he said, setting down his knife. "It fades, much like truth." The rest of the meal passed in silence. Days blurred into a quiet routine. Her chambers were richly appointed, yet felt more like confinement than comfort. When she attempted to walk the gardens alone, she was stopped by a servant carrying his orders. The Duke prefers Miss Fairborn remain indoors. The west wing, as he had said, stayed locked, its corridors silent behind carved oak doors. At night she sometimes heard footsteps there, slow and measured, but when she asked, no one dared answer. Cold meals, locked wings, silent dinners. This was Thornhaven. Yet, dear listeners, there is a peculiar strength born of silence. Beatrix did not weep. She did not beg. She read by the fire until the candles burned low, and when the servants whispered apologies, she smiled and thanked them as though she were a guest by choice. Her gentleness unsettled them. Her stillness, more defiant than rebellion, unsettled him. The Duke found himself watching her without meaning to. Once, he entered the drawing-room unannounced to find her by the window, sketching the snow-dusted gardens. She rose at once, but he stopped her. "Continue," he said, his voice unreadable. She obeyed, the quill trembling slightly in her hand. For the first time, he noticed the care in her strokes, the patience in her touch. It was not art born of vanity, but of endurance. When she left, the sketch remained. Later that night, the Duke found himself studying it. The garden walls, though accurately drawn, appeared softer under her hand, as though she had seen beauty even in stone. He folded the page and kept it, though he would never admit why. London, meanwhile, devoured the story. The tongue whispered of Thornhaven's new resident. "He's hiding her," said Lady Adelaide. "He's enthralled," replied another. The gossip grew bold, painting her as mistress, muse, prisoner. And through it all, the Duke said nothing. Silence, again, became his defence. But silence cannot hide truth forever. One evening, Beatrix found herself alone in the gallery, tracing the edges of a portrait, a woman with pale eyes and a smile that did not reach them. "She was beautiful," Beatrix murmured. "My mother," came the voice behind her. The Duke stood in the doorway, his expression as still as the painting. Beatrix turned, startled. "She looks kind." "She was not," he replied. His gaze lingered on the canvas, then on her. "Nor am I." "You are cruel," she said quietly, "but not unkind." He flinched, a movement so slight it might have been imagined. "You presume too much, and you hide too much," she answered. That night he did not dine at all, but something in him had shifted. The next morning, the servants found her breakfast tray untouched, replaced by one of his own, warmer, richer, placed quietly outside her door. He would deny it if asked. He would deny it even to himself. Yet for the first time in years, the Duke of Thornhaven felt the faint stirrings of something he could neither name nor banish. A spark, small but insistent, had found its way through the cold. And though the world beyond Thornhaven roared with laughter and scandal, within those walls, silence began to change its shape. It no longer punished. It listened. Beatrix's quiet resilience, her refusal to cower, her unspoken grace. These became the mirror in which the Duke could no longer ignore himself. And so, my dearest, the lie that began in pride now deepens into something far more dangerous. For where deceit takes root, emotion soon follows, and even the coldest of men must one day face the fire he himself has kindled. London thrives upon the tremors of scandal, and none tremble louder than those born of restraint. For while the Ton still debates whether Miss Fairborn is the Duke's charity, his folly, or his captive, Thornhaven itself has grown perilously silent. It is within that silence that hearts begin to stir, though neither dares admit it. The season's storms arrived early this year. Rain sweeps across the moors, lashing against Thornhaven's proud facade like a beast denied entry. Inside, the great estate hums with unease. The Duke sits in his study, a fortress of oak and shadow, the firelight cutting sharp edges across his face. A knock sounds, light, hesitant, and there she stands, hands folded, her composure calm but trembling beneath the surface. "You asked for tea, Your Grace," she says softly. The tray trembles only slightly in her grasp. He rises to take it from her, a small, meaningless gesture. And yet the moment his gloved hand brushes hers, meaning ceases to be small. For the first time since her arrival, Arthur Thornhaven looks at her, truly looks. Her lashes catch the firelight, her lips part as though to speak, but neither does. Silence stretches between them, charged and fragile. "Thank you, Miss Fairborn," he says at last. His tone, meant to dismiss, falters into something near civility. She inclines her head and turns to go, but his next words stop her. "You are unafraid of me," he observes. She looks back. Should I be? He should not have smiled, but he does, the faintest, unwilling curve of lips unused to softness. "Most are." "Then they do not see you clearly," she answers, the words quiet, but sharp enough to wound. It is she who leaves the room this time, yet it is he who feels as though he has been dismissed. Ah, my listeners, how swiftly disdain unravels when curiosity takes root. The Duke, who once sought solitude as refuge, now finds it intolerable. He hears her footsteps in the hall long after she has gone. He notices the scent of jasmine trailing faintly behind her, the sound of her laughter, rare, unguarded, echoing in the corridor when she thinks herself alone. But pride, that cruel and constant sentinel, still guards his heart. That evening, as the storm deepens, she is summoned to dine. The thunder rolls like distant drums, and the candles flicker as though even the flames anticipate confrontation. Beatrix enters, her gown a simple cream that glows in the dim light. The Duke rises briefly, habit more than courtesy, and gestures for her to sit. The meal begins as always, with silence sharp enough to cut through porcelain. But tonight, Beatrix breaks it. "You do not enjoy company, Your Grace," she remarks, her tone even. He looks up, eyes narrowed. "I enjoy peace, Miss Fairborn. There is a difference. Peace," she says, "is found, not enforced." He freezes. No one has ever spoken to him so plainly, not since her. He sets down his glass, studying this merchant's daughter who dares to defy him in his own home. "You presume much," he says, but his voice lacks its usual steel. "Perhaps," she replies, unflinching, "but perhaps presumption is the only courage allowed to women like me." The rain strikes the windows harder then, as though the heavens themselves lean closer to listen, and in that moment the Duke finds no words at all. Later that night the storm grows wild. Thunder shakes the halls and lightning spills through the corridors like liquid silver. Beatrix, restless, wanders toward the library, the only room where warmth still lingers. She does not expect to find him there, yet she does. He stands before the window, coat discarded, sleeves rolled to his elbows, eyes dark as the tempest outside. "The storm unsettles you?" he asks without turning. "Not the storm," she answers, "the waiting." He faces her then, and though neither moves, the space between them feels perilously narrow. The lightning flashes again, illuminating the hollows beneath his eyes. The tension wound tight in his shoulders. "You should not walk these halls alone," he says quietly. "And yet I do," she replies, "because you forbid it." A pause. The air hums, full of unsaid truths. "You find fault in my care?" "I find fault in your prisons." His breath catches, his composure fracturing for a heartbeat. He takes a step forward and she does not retreat. "You think me cruel," he murmurs. "I think you wounded," she says. For one suspended instant, pride collapses. He reaches out, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. A touch so light it might have been imagined. Her breath trembles, and for a moment, it seems he might confess something unspoken, something buried deep. But then, pride, ever the tyrant, reclaims its throne. He withdraws his hand as swiftly as if burned. "You should return to your chambers, Miss Fairborn," he says, voice cold once more. Her chin lifts, steady. "As you command, Your Grace." She turns, skirts whispering against the stone floor, leaving him alone with the storm, and with himself. When dawn comes, Thornhaven stands quiet again, but something irrevocable has shifted. The servants whisper that their duke did not sleep, that he paced until the first light broke through the clouds. In London, the ton continues its cruel sport. They gossip over tea and toast. Has the duke tamed her, or has she tamed him? Yet none know the truth, that neither is master now. Two hearts once so certain of their boundaries now tremble upon the edge of something neither understands nor dares to name. Ah, but one might pity the duke, if pity were fashionable. For what is more dangerous than a man who fears feeling more than scandal itself? And what, dear listener, could be more intoxicating than the rebellion of one quiet heart teaching another how to beat again? Would you guard your honour or follow your heart, gentle listener? How quickly affection turns to ache when truth begins to whisper through locked doors. I have long said that the ton delights in its illusions. But what happens when one of its greatest deceivers faces the ruin of his own heart? It began, as all revelations do, with curiosity. The west wing of Thornhaven, long forbidden, stood silent for months. Yet on one grey afternoon, when the storm clouds hung heavy as secrets, Beatrix found its door ajar. Perhaps a careless servant left it so. Or perhaps the house itself, weary of silence, invited her in. She stepped lightly through the threshold. Dust clung to the air like memory, and the scent of lavender, faded but stubborn, lingered still. The corridor stretched long and dim, portraits lining the walls like sentinels. And there, at the very end, she saw her. A woman, immortalized in oil and shadow, pale skin, eyes the colour of moonlit glass, and a faint smile that seemed to hide as much as it revealed. The frame bore a single name in gold: Eleanor. Beatrix froze. She had heard the name before, whispered by servants after midnight. The Duke's fiancé, the one rumoured to have perished by his hand. A floorboard creaked behind her. "You should not be here." The Duke's voice, low and rough, filled the hall. He stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable in the half-light. "I did not mean to intrude," Beatrix said softly. "I heard no warning." His eyes flicked to the portrait. "That door was locked for a reason." "She was beautiful," Beatrix whispered. "She was foolish," he replied too quickly. But the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Beatrix turned to face him. "They say you killed her." For a moment nothing moved. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a sound more sigh than laugh, Arthur said, "London will say anything that makes the world easier to stomach." "Then tell me the truth." His jaw tightened. "You would not want to hear it." "I would rather know a cruel truth than live in a kind lie," she said, her voice trembling but sure. A long silence stretched between them, and then, finally, he spoke. "It was raining that night," he began, his tone distant as if reciting from a memory he could not escape. "We were returning from the opera. She laughed at something I said, something trivial, I cannot even recall it now, and she leaned out of the carriage to see the lightning. The horses spooked. I reached for her, but... He paused, his breath catching. She fell. I jumped after her. The carriage overturned. By the time I reached her, it was too late. Beatrix's hand rose to her lips. You tried to save her. I failed to, he said quietly, and failure is the same as guilt. She took a step forward. That is not what London says. London, he muttered, wasn't there. He turned away, his hands gripping the back of a nearby chair. They needed a monster, so I gave them one. A duke who doesn't dance, who doesn't love, who doesn't bleed. It was easier than trying to explain the truth to people who only listen for scandal. Beatrix's eyes softened. And you believed that by punishing yourself you were honouring her? His shoulders stiffened, but he did not answer. You've locked yourself in her memory, she said, and now you're rotting beside her ghost. His head snapped up, eyes dark. You presume too much, Miss Fairbairn. Perhaps, she said, voice steady. But perhaps someone must. He took a step toward her then, dangerous, desperate. And what would you know of ghosts? What would you know of loss? Enough, she said quietly. Enough to see it in your eyes. The words struck him like a blow. For the first time, Arthur Thornhaven, London's most ruthless duke, looked undone. The armour of indifference slipped, revealing something far more fragile beneath. Grief, guilt, and a longing he could not name. Do you think I enjoy this? He said hoarsely. The silence, the cruelty, the endless pretense of control. I cannot change what happened. I cannot bring her back, but I can make sure I never destroy anyone else. You have not destroyed me, Beatrix whispered. His gaze met hers, fierce and searching. Not yet. She stepped closer, then stopped trying to. The air between them tightened. He exhaled shakily, closing his eyes. You don't understand, Beatrix. I'm not fit for kindness. Everything I touch, you push away, she finished softly. Because it's easier to be feared than forgiven. He opened his eyes then, and she saw the truth there, a man breaking quietly beneath the weight of his own heart. I should have died with her, he said, voice low. But you didn't, she replied. And perhaps that means you were meant to live, for something else. Her words hung between them, fragile and trembling like glass. He laughed bitterly. You are a foolish woman. Then let me be foolish, she said, her tone barely above a whisper. But do not mistake compassion for weakness. Silence settled once more. Then, slowly, he reached up, fingers brushing the edge of the portrait's frame. I've kept her here, he murmured, as if the room could hold her better than memory. Beatrix's gaze softened. Perhaps it's time to let her rest. He turned to her. And if I cannot? Then let me remember her with you, she said. A tremor passed through him, visible even in the flickering light. He took a step closer, the distance between them vanishing until only air and grief remained. His voice was rough when he spoke. Why stay, Beatrix? I've given you every reason to leave. She met his gaze without fear. Because you need someone to remind you that you're still alive. Something in him cracked then, not loudly but deeply. He looked at her as though seeing sunlight after years in shadow. You're a fool, he whispered again. Perhaps, she said, but not alone in it. Outside the rain began to fall, soft, steady, cleansing. For the first time the Duke did not look away. The fire behind them hissed, and in that quiet room filled with ghosts, Beatrix Fairbairn chose not to flee. She stood before the man the world called ruthless and saw the truth beneath the velvet, a soul bound not by cruelty but by remorse. He turned from her, one hand covering his eyes, his composure fracturing at last. And though she said nothing more, her presence alone spoke louder than pity could. Ah, my dearest listeners, even the coldest heart hides its wound somewhere soft. And sometimes compassion, not passion, is the truest rebellion of all. That night, Thornhaven did not sleep. But by dawn one could almost swear that the air itself had shifted, lighter, gentler, touched by something dangerously close to forgiveness. London's appetite for ruin has always been matched only by its taste for elegance, and nothing delights our fair society more than the fall of the proud. Yet even I, your ever-watchful chronicler, must confess, some tragedies arrive not by fate, but by the trembling hand of envy. It began with ink. A single column, a forgery of my very own quill, swept through the parlours and drawing-rooms of the ton like wildfire. It bore my familiar flourish, my signature irony, but beneath the gilded phrasing hid venom. The Duke of Thornhaven, it declared, keeps a mistress not of noble birth but of mercantile blood. The lady resides under his roof, adored and imprisoned, the prettiest scandal London has ever purchased. The handwriting was elegant, the cruelty exquisite, and though the author was none other than Lord Silas, the Duke's rival and long-time tormentor, the damage was done. By afternoon, Thornhaven's servants whispered behind closed doors. By evening, the streets murmured. And by nightfall, the whispers had become gospel. Inside the grand estate, Beatrix Fairborn sat by the window, her hands clasped tight upon her lap, as thunder echoed distantly. A folded paper lay before her, that cursed forgery. She had read it once, and once was enough. He found her thus, silent in the glow of the hearth. His steps were measured, but his eyes betrayed the storm within. "You've seen it," Arthur said. She did not turn. "They call me your mistress. They call you 1,000 things they cannot comprehend," he said bitterly. "Tomorrow they will call you something else." Her voice trembled, but her words did not. "Will you deny it?" He faltered. "It is beneath denial." "No, Your Grace," she said quietly, finally meeting his gaze. "It is not beneath you. It is upon me." The fire crackled between them. Outside, the rain began its slow, mournful descent. "You think I do not care?" he said, stepping closer. "Every word printed in that vile paper burns my name too." "But your name will survive," she said. "Mine will not." His composure wavered. For the first time, the Duke looked lost. "I will correct it. I will find who did this." She shook her head. "You cannot correct what London chooses to believe." Her quiet strength cut deeper than accusation ever could. He turned away, one hand gripping the mantle. "Then what do you suggest, Miss Fairborn?" "Let me leave," she whispered. He turned sharply. "No. It is the only way." "You think I would cast you to their mercy?" he said, his tone low and dangerous. "Do you think me that heartless?" "I think you care too much for pride to see what mercy requires," she said softly. His hand slammed against the mantle. "You have no idea what you're asking." "I do," she replied, tears brimming but unshed. "I am asking you to let me go before they destroy us both." He took a step toward her, but she did not retreat. "You said once," she continued, "that you could not bear to ruin another life. Then do not start with mine." Her words hung between them like a blade. He looked at her, this woman who had seen past his cruelty, his grief, his mask. And in her eyes, he saw not fear, but acceptance. It was unbearable. "Beatrix," his voice cracked, "if you go, they will call you ruined. They already do." He drew a breath that sounded like defeat. "And if I keep you here, they will call me worse." Silence fell. The kind of silence that separates hearts already breaking. When he finally spoke, it was with the cold precision of a man trying to save the one thing he cannot bear to lose. "Then I will send you away myself," he said, his voice stripped of tenderness. "You will have funds, protection, a carriage at dawn." Beatrix's throat tightened. "Do you mean it?" He hesitated. That hesitation was answer enough. She nodded once. Then I shall not keep you waiting." He looked at her as though memorizing something precious, something doomed. Then, without another word, he left the room. The rain intensified, as though the heavens themselves mourned what neither would confess. When dawn came, Thornhaven stood shrouded in mist. The carriage waited in the courtyard, its lamps dimmed by the storm. Beatrix stepped out, a cloak drawn tightly around her shoulders. The servants watched from the windows, pitying, curious, powerless. Arthur stood by the steps, his expression unreadable. He offered no farewell, no touch, no plea, only silence. Beatrix paused before him. "I would thank you for your kindness," she said quietly, "but I think it would wound you to hear it." He met her gaze, and for a fleeting second, the mask cracked. The man who stood before her was no duke, no ruthless lord, but the broken soul she had glimpsed behind locked doors. She stepped into the carriage. The door closed. The wheels began to turn. Rain lashed against the windows as Thornhaven faded from view. Inside, Beatrix's hands trembled in her lap, but she did not weep. She had seen too much of pride to waste tears on it. Outside, the Duke stood motionless in the storm, the wind tearing at his coat, his hair soaked, his jaw clenched against everything he could not say. When the carriage disappeared into the distance, he turned back toward the manor, now hollow, echoing, alive only with ghosts. London, of course, rejoiced. The ton thrived upon the scandal's bloom. "She's gone," Lady Adelaide whispered behind her fan, "disgraced, dismissed, and forgotten. But you and I, dear listener, know better. The Duke of Thornhaven is many things, proud, ruthless, feared, yet none of those qualities can quiet the ache of absence. The great halls of Thornhaven, once filled with silence, now carry a different kind of emptiness, one shaped like her name." By nightfall, he sat once more before the portrait of Eleanor, his first love, the ghost who had ruled his heart, yet the eyes he now sought in memory were not hers. They were softer, steadier, and gone. He pressed a hand to his brow, whispering into the dark, "Forgive me." Whether to the living or the dead, even he did not know. And thus, dear listeners, another tragedy joins the annals of our glittering society. The ton adores tragedy, so long as it is not their own. It is one thing for a man to guard his pride, and quite another to watch that pride devour him whole. Yet it seems the Duke of Thornhaven has at last glimpsed the beast within his own reflection. The revelation came not through confession, but through confrontation. It was Lord Silas himself, ever the serpent in silk, who delivered the truth, carelessly disguised as victory. Picture it, the smoky warmth of the gentleman's club at Grosvenor Square, heavy with arrogance and laughter. Silas raised his glass and said, "One must admire your restraint, Thornhaven, to dismiss your little charity project so swiftly after she served her purpose." Arthur's jaw tightened. "Mind your tongue." "Ah, but it was a fine forgery, was it not?" Silas continued, his smile gleaming. "That column had your entire circle aflame. Whistledown herself could not have penned it better. You should thank me. It saved you the trouble of admitting affection where there was none." Silence fell. Sharp, electric, deadly. The Duke stood so suddenly that his chair scraped the marble. For once the room dared to look at him directly. "You wrote it," he said, his voice low, deadly calm. Silas's smirk faltered. "You cannot prove—" Arthur struck the glass from his hand. It shattered like truth breaking open. "Proof," the Duke said, stepping closer, "is unnecessary when one already knows." And thus, dear listeners, the air in that room grew colder than the rain outside. For in that instant, the mighty Duke of Thornhaven, the man who had chosen silence over sentiment, saw what his restraint had cost him. Beatrix Fairborn. Her name was no longer a whisper but a wound. He left the club without another word. Those who followed spoke of a haunted man moving through the streets, as though chased by the very ghosts he once refused to acknowledge. His carriage cut through the fog toward St. James, toward the palace itself, toward the court that ruled all reputations. For if London had taken Beatrix's name, Arthur intended to give it back, no matter the cost. When he entered the Queen's reception hall, all conversation ceased. The marble gleamed beneath chandeliers, and nobles froze mid-bow. The Duke's arrival was not scheduled. Such impropriety was unthinkable. Yet there he was, drenched in stormlight and fury, the very picture of rebellion in a perfectly tailored coat. "Your Grace," murmured a courtier, pale with shock, "Her Majesty is—" "Summon her," Arthur said. His tone left no room for refusal. Moments later, the Queen entered, regal, severe, her eyes like tempered glass. "Duke Thornhaven," she said coolly, "I trust there is reason for this intrusion." "There is," he replied, bowing briefly. "A lie has been printed in my name, a lie that has destroyed an innocent woman." The Queen regarded him with a faint smile. "Then you have finally discovered the limits of your own control." "I have discovered," he said, voice rough, "that control is a coward's refuge. I will not live behind it any longer." A murmur rippled through the assembly. The Duke, the very embodiment of restraint, had raised his voice. "She is gone," he continued, "because I believed silence was mercy. I see now that silence is nothing but pride dressed in mourning clothes." The Queen tilted her head. "And what would you have me do?" "I would have London know the truth," Arthur said, "that Beatrix Fairborn was not my mistress but the only woman who ever saw me as more than my title." A collective gasp filled the chamber. Even the chandeliers seemed to tremble. The Queen's gaze softened, just slightly. "And why should I risk my reputation for your confession, Your Grace?" "Because," he said, meeting her eyes with quiet conviction, "if men of rank cannot own their sins, then what hope remains for the rest of us?" For a moment, all was still. Then the Queen, in her infinite amusement, said, "So the Duke of Thornhaven has learned humility." He bowed his head. "I have learned love." Her lips curved almost imperceptibly. "Then prove it." The command was clear, not in private but before all. By the next morning, word spread faster than fire across dry paper. The Duke of Thornhaven had requested audience at the Queen's public court. Carriages lined the palace gates. The ton gathered, hungry for spectacle, expecting arrogance but finding repentance instead. He stood upon the dais, the crowd below murmuring like restless waves. The Queen watched, silent and unyielding. Arthur's voice carried through the chamber. "I once thought myself unassailable. I have wealth, power, and the envy of every man who cannot bear the weight of his own reflection. But I tell you this, none of it is worth the silence I purchased with her pain." Whispers spread, scandal blooming anew. "Beatrix Fairborn," he continued, "was accused of sins she never committed. I allowed it. I hid behind my name while she bore my shame. But I will do so no longer. I would rather lose every ounce of status than remain the man she believed I could never be." He paused. "If London demands a villain, let it be me." Ah, dear listeners, how swiftly the tide of gossip turns when courage enters the room. Even the Queen's advisers, those creatures of etiquette and deceit, fell silent. Then, the most shocking act of all, the Duke of Thornhaven knelt, before the throne, before the ton, before the world that had once adored his cruelty. "I seek permission to restore her name," he said. "And if redemption demands more, then let it take me whole." The Queen's expression softened into something that might have been admiration. "Rise, Your Grace. I suspect you have already redeemed more than one soul this day." And with that, the court erupted, in whispers, in awe, in disbelief. By dusk, the city that had once condemned him now trembled with fascination. I, Lady Whistledown, could not resist the poetry of it. The mighty Duke of Thornhaven, once the coldest heart in England, brought to his knees, not by power, but by the ghost of the woman he drove away. Ah, but do not mistake this for conclusion, gentle listeners, for love, once exiled, must still find its way home. And even power, as I so often remind you, must bow when love remembers its heart. One might think London has seen every spectacle, every scandal, every heartbreak turned to gossip by morning's ink. Yet last night, at Her Majesty's Royal Ball, something most astonishing occurred. The Duke of Thornhaven, that pillar of pride and precision, shattered centuries of decorum with 3 words that silenced an entire court. But allow me to begin where all redemption stories must, with the invitation. It was delivered in person. Beatrix Fairborn, once the subject of whispers too cruel to repeat, found herself staring at the Duke's seal pressed in gold. She had been living quietly in the countryside, tucked away at her aunt's modest estate. When the carriage arrived, she thought it a mistake, until she broke the wax and read, "Come to the royal ball, tomorrow. One last truth, before the world." Signed simply, Arthur. Her pulse faltered. The very name that had once meant pain now echoed with something heavier, possibility. She did not intend to go. And yet when dusk fell and the moon climbed high, her heart betrayed her resolve. For curiosity, dear listeners, is the first step toward forgiveness. The ballroom at St. James's Palace glittered brighter than 1,000 stars. Every duchess, viscount and baroness was present, their jewels flashing like blades. The Queen herself presided, her expression unreadable, for she, too, had heard whispers of the Duke's plan. Arthur entered alone. His black coat cut a sharp figure against the light, his posture regal yet unguarded. The crowd parted for him like the tide before a storm. Every woman's fan stilled, every man turned to watch. And then she appeared. Beatrix stood at the threshold, her gown the colour of soft ivory, untouched by ostentation. No jewels, no silk gloves, only quiet grace. She might have been invisible in that room of gold, had the Duke not moved the moment he saw her. Their eyes met. Ah, dear listeners, the hush that followed was almost holy. The orchestra faltered. Even the chandeliers seemed to hold their breath. Arthur crossed the ballroom floor, his every step measured, deliberate. A man walking through years of guilt toward the only thing worth saving. The murmurs began like the rustle of silk. Is that her? The merchant's daughter? He would not dare. He dared. Without bowing, without preamble, he extended his hand to her. "Miss Fairborn," he said softly, his voice carrying across the room, "would you grant me a dance?" She hesitated. "Your Grace, I believe London has had quite enough of our theatrics." A flicker of a smile ghosted his lips. "Then let us give them a different ending." And before she could retreat, he took her hand, gloved and trembling, and led her to the centre of the floor. The musicians, uncertain but obedient, began to play. The waltz swelled, slow, haunting, familiar. It was the same melody that had once played the night he lied. Only now, there was no deception. They moved as if no one else existed. Her voice was barely a whisper. "You shouldn't have called me here." "I had no choice," he replied. "You left with my peace, and I can no longer live without it." Peace cannot be built upon regret. He looked at her then, truly looked, and the mask he had worn for so long crumbled. "Then let me build it upon truth." The music faltered again, for the Duke of Thornhaven had released her hand, turned toward the Queen's dais, and raised his voice for all to hear. "My Queen," he declared, "for too long I have hidden behind pride and let falsehood stand. Tonight I make my truth known before every eye that ever judged her." Gasps erupted. The violins stilled entirely. He turned to Beatrix, the room his witness. "This woman was called my mistress, my ruin, my shame. Yet she is none of those things. She is my redemption." Whispers surged like thunder. Nobles leaned forward. Arthur stepped closer. "It began with a lie, one I told to wound a rival and shield my pride, but it ends with truth. I have loved her from the moment she defied me, from the moment she refused to be small." Her breath caught. "Arthur!" "Let them talk," he said. Let them print their columns and sip their scandal. I would rather be ruined beside you than worshipped alone." The Queen rose from her throne, her lips curved with quiet satisfaction. "Then, Your Grace, you had best prove it." And he did. Before the entire court, the Duke of Thornhaven sank to one knee. His voice broke as he spoke. "Beatrix Fairborn, I once chained you to my pride. Tonight I release you from every chain. But if you will have me, I would bind myself to you instead, as husband, as equal, as man to woman." A silence fell so deep it seemed the world itself waited. Beatrix's eyes glistened. The same man who had once imprisoned her now knelt in surrender. In that stillness, all the pain, the humiliation, the nights of silence collapsed into one fragile truth. He had changed. She reached out, not with grandeur, but with trembling grace, and touched his cheek. "Then rise, Arthur," she whispered, "for I will not marry a man on his knees." Laughter rippled softly through the crowd, then applause, first uncertain, then thunderous. Nobles rose to their feet. Even the Queen clapped once, slowly, sealing the spectacle into legend. Arthur rose, tears unashamed on his face, and took Beatrix's hand once more. Together they turned toward the ballroom. The music began anew, swelling like the heartbeat of London itself. This time when they danced, it was not for show. Her head rested against his chest. His voice brushed her ear. "Forgive me," he murmured. She smiled through tears. "I already have." Around them, the ton's gossip transformed into applause. Not mockery, but something startlingly close to admiration. For the first time, London's cruel eyes softened. Perhaps even they, so obsessed with perfection, could not resist the power of love reborn. The chandeliers shimmered as if scattering blessings across the floor. The Queen turned to her courtiers and whispered, "He was never meant to be tamed, only redeemed." And so it was, dear listeners, that the lie which began in vanity ended in truth. The merchant's daughter became the Duchess of Thornhaven, not through scandal, but through courage. As I dipped my quill into ink that night, I found myself writing not with irony, but with awe. For in all my years chronicling London's glittering sins, never had I witnessed a man surrender so completely to the mercy of love. And thus, London gained not a reformed duke, but a redeemed one. I do adore when history repeats itself, only softer, sweeter, wrapped in satin rather than scandal. For once again, Thornhaven's marble halls gleam beneath the winter chandeliers, and London's most distinguished hearts have gathered for a night of elegance, gossip, and redemption. But this year my quill trembles with amusement. The invitations were signed not by the Duke, but by the Duchess, Beatrix of Thornhaven. Ah, yes, the same woman who once stood at the edge of a ballroom, uncertain and invisible, now reigns as hostess of the grandest gala in London. She greets her guests beneath a cascade of crystal light, her poise effortless, her smile serene. And those who once whispered cruelty behind jewelled fans now bow lower than they ever did before. The Duchess is radiant, not with diamonds, but with peace. The gown she wears is pale blue, embroidered with silver ivy, modest and regal all at once. It is said the Duke himself commissioned the fabric from Paris, claiming, "No jewel should outshine her eyes." And where, you ask, is the Duke? Standing at her side, of course. Arthur of Thornhaven, once feared, once untouchable, now carries himself not as a man defending a title, but as one who has finally found home. The lines at his brow, once carved from restraint, now soften when he looks at her. He greets each guest with polite civility, but his gaze always drifts back to his wife, as though the world holds nothing worth seeing beyond her. The musicians begin the first waltz. The same melody that once birthed a lie now breathes forgiveness into the air. Guests murmur of its poetry. The Duke and Duchess dancing once more beneath winter's crown, but this time without pretense. They move together with ease, two souls no longer performing but belonging. "Do you remember the first time?" Beatrix whispers. Arthur's lips curve faintly. I remember pretending not to care. And now? Now I would cross every scandal again just to have this one truth. Oh dear listeners, how delightfully sentimental. One could almost forget this is the same man who once believed love a weakness. Yet as he bends to brush his lips against his wife's hand before the entire ton, I find myself thinking, perhaps weakness was merely another name for longing. Across the ballroom, the Queen herself observes the couple with quiet satisfaction. A reformed duke, a young baroness dares to murmur. The Queen's smile is knowing. No, my dear, a redeemed one. Outside, snow begins to fall, soft, deliberate, as though heaven itself wished to erase the ink of their former shame. The same carriages that once carried gossip now carry blessings, and I, your ever-watchful chronicler, cannot help but sigh at the transformation. For months now, Thornhaven has been the subject of fascination. The papers call it the Great Redemption. Society, ever fickle, now claims they always saw it coming. But let us not forget, my listeners, how quickly admiration replaces condemnation when a title and a heart survive their scandal intact. Yet within the grand estate's walls, there is no concern for reputation. Only warmth. The Duke has reopened Thornhaven's West Wing, the very place once locked to the world. It now houses an orphanage for young girls of humble birth, founded by the Duchess herself. No woman, she told the Queen, should be punished for her circumstances. Her Majesty's reply: "You are the first Duchess to rule with grace rather than envy. May London learn from you." In the library, yes, that same room where cold dinners and colder silences once reigned, laughter now fills the air. Servants speak freely. Music echoes late into the night. The Thornhaven estate breathes again. Later, when the crowd has dwindled and only candlelight remains, Beatrix steps onto the balcony. The garden below glows beneath the snow, the same place she once dreamed of escaping from. Arthur joins her there, draping his coat around her shoulders without a word. For a long while, they simply watch the snow fall. "It's strange," she says softly. "Once I thought this house would swallow me whole." He turns toward her, his voice tender. "And now?" "Now it feels alive." He smiles. "Because you are here." Below them, the laughter of guests drifts upward, mingling with the hush of snow. The Duchess leans her head against his shoulder. The ruthless Duke, the man who never danced, never smiled, never loved, lets out a quiet breath, as though peace were finally something he could touch. And I, Lady Whistledown, observing from behind my lace fan, find my quill reluctant to write the final line. For once London has offered me not scandal, but serenity. Still, tradition demands a closing stroke. And so, with due reverence, I inscribe this final truth. Indeed, even the coldest heart may bloom again beneath the scandalous sun of love. Tell me, dear listeners, do you believe redemption rewrites every sin of pride? Whisper below and stay tuned for my next revelation.